Shadiversity.
Oh boy, let's get into a controversial subject, eh? Here we go. Greetings, I'm Shad, and this video is somewhat of a follow-up to a previous video I did addressing the interesting question of can women fight effectively with swords, specifically against men? Please do go watch that video if you haven't seen it already, because it's a good lead into this, because now I want to address something I did address in the last video, but I want to address it in more depth in this one, and that's in how can women fight effectively in a battlefield, because the previous one was a response to Andrew Clavin, who said that no woman could fight with a sword. And he later did kind of, shift the goalposts to re-contextualize what he was saying, even though he did say what he said was 100% correct when he later said afterwards, I will admit there are exceptions, which would imply what he said was not 100% correct. And so there's a bit of a contradiction in what was being said there, which is unfortunate because Andrew Clavin is actually a decent guy. Look, if you disagree with his opinions, that is separate to how well he would treat someone who he meets on the street, and is a decent guy, okay? So in the shifted goalposts, and this is where a lot of people were trying to come back to what I was saying in my original videos. Like, no, this isn't about sword fighting, it's about how they function on a medieval battlefield, and a medieval battlefield is completely different. It is different, but does that mean the ultimate conclusion is different, when the conclusion is that women would not be able to fight in a medieval sword battle, which was the new context Andrew put to his words. And I think it's absolutely worth discussing and exploring, because I don't care about the controversy, I don't care about the politics. I find it an intriguing subject, especially for me as a writer, someone who loves the medieval period, and someone who loves adapting it into fantasy. And one of the things that I love to do is adapting it accurately, and I want things to be realistic. And so me, I'm a guy, okay? Every nerd from the dawn of time thought a girl using a sword was hot, all right? And so we have never had a problem with strong female characters and stuff like that. We get annoyed with Mary Sue's when they're not done right, but there are so many female action heroes that guys have always loved. I mean, there's Ripley, but the end goes on and on.
I am no man.
And so for me as a writer and a guy, okay, it's cool, all right? We want to do that, and I want to kind of incorporate them in a realistic way, which means addressing everything in a realistic manner, and also addressing some of the problems that existed historically, because historically, women didn't fight in battle. So why? Now, in the previous video, I would like to think that the myth, the idea that women can't fight effectively with swords, and that is then thereby extended to other melee-based weapons, is debunked. They can. It's been proven in modern-day competitive HEMA, okay? Then people did ask, okay, they can compete on the same level as men with swords, but do they win the tournaments? And I didn't know, but I looked it up, and yeah, there are a number of times women have won open tournaments, which is a complete mix between men. Does it happen more often? No, of course not. All right. Those natural strength differences still play into effect, as I mentioned in my previous video and stuff like that. But the idea that women can't beat men in sword fighting and combat that uses weapons, and even unarmed. Unarmed is more difficult, but they can, okay? That needs to be debunked, okay? We need to correct the misconception that it can happen, but there are other interesting complexities that arise when you try and apply it to a medieval battlefield. The other thing that we need to understand, okay, because there's the whole thing, and I even mentioned in this previous video, about all things being equal. Skill is the biggest difference, okay? And most determining factor as to who's going to win. But if you say, if skill was even, okay, and the only difference were the average strength and physical differences that men and women have on average, who's going to win? And the answer is, well, of course, the man is going to win, but that also, there's a bit of important thing. is not going to win all the time, okay? Luck and just mistakes. No matter how skilled you are, sometimes you just do the wrong move, okay? And so it's never going to be 100%. In actual fact, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's something like 80% of the time the man is going to win. If all things being equal, the only difference of strength could it be higher, 90, but it's never going to be 100%, okay? Because sometimes you just get lucky, you choose the right move, the person makes a mistake and you are able to exploit it. And because of that, even someone who is significantly less skilled can still beat a superior opponent. And in actual fact, there's this idea in hematries and stuff like that about fighting someone who is unskilled can actually be more dangerous because they generally don't understand how easy it is to be hit and stuff like that, and they're willing to do far more riskier moves to beat their opponent, and usually will end in doubles. But when you're fighting a competent opponent, you can generally be assured that they're not going to try and commit suicide to win. They don't want to die, but unskilled opponents tend to do that a lot more often, which can actually make them even more difficult to fight because they can be a bit crazy. So that needs to also be understood that, yes, absolutely, unskilled opponents can still beat opponents that are even more skilled, okay? So never, even, you know, all things being equal, high skill, even low skill, and things like that, is it going to be 100%. That should be understood. Oh, and the next thing I would like to address is that a very disingenuous response people have, come back in response to that video was that HEMA. No, I mean it's not an accurate analog to actual combat with a sword. They're just tapping each other. People who say that don't know much about HEMA. Okay. Most HEMA tournaments don't count strikes that were not done with authority and intent, meaning proper edge alignment with the right amount of force that would have done actual damage, okay? HEMA is actually a brilliant analog for real sword fighting. And people who say that's not, don't know much about HEMA, okay? So that's wrong. And yes, HEMA also allows grappling, okay? Grappling, picking people out and stuff. The problem is if your opponent has a sword, it's very risky and can be far more difficult to initiate that grapple. So even if you're a man fighting a woman and you have greater advantage in a grapple against her, just rushing in to try and grab her while she has a sword is a very risky thing, okay? So, yeah, absolutely. And it's also moving the goalposts again because even Andrew said there's no physical, contact sport that women compete like on an even level against men. No, there is. HEMA, that happens. And then they're like, move the goalposts. Oh, no, but it doesn't reflect actual combat. It does. One, that wasn't the initial proposition. It was just any contact sport.
And all you have to do to prove that I'm wrong is mention a single contact sport in which women can compete with men. They can't.
Which was proven directly that there is a contact sport that women and men compete. And two, it moves the goalposts like, oh, no, because it doesn't, and that's wrong because it does simulate sword combat very effectively. Does it simulate warfare? No. Okay, warfare is a completely different mix. And the idea that it would naturally, because warfare in every situation is going to give more disadvantages to physically weaker members of the army, is an assumption, okay? In actual fact, fighting in a unit, you might be able to overcome physical strength limitations better in a unit formation, warfare formation, than on a one-on-one fight, okay? But people always jump to the assumption that helps their own argument when in actual, no, there's far more complexity. Now, are there situations in a war, in our unit, you have your unit, infantrymen or whatever, in which strength becomes important and more useful, and you would be negatively affected in the battle itself from having lesser strength? Yeah, of course there are circumstances, but it's not a universally applicable thing where this strength disadvantage always applies. Because again, weapons are force multipliers, and there's a very important element in regards to larger scale battles. Tactics, okay? Now, when it comes to one-on-one fighting, generally we always refer it's just skill, okay? But skill involves tactics as well. But when it comes to a battlefield, you have a commander directing, okay, troops. And therefore you could have a unit that is not as skilled, but if you employ the right tactics, they can still win. And there are countless examples where an inferior force, usually numbers, but it can be also a force that is equipped with less, weapons that aren't well made. There might be farming tools that are jury-rigged into weapons and things. And there are so many things, situations in which you have a force that is legitimately disadvantaged for any number of reasons, okay? And they still win because of effective tactics, outflanking, all the outs, okay, against the opponent. And this would absolutely apply to a force whose the average strength representation of the soldiers among them is on average lower than the opponents they are fighting. And so in this situation, we might be looking at a unit that's comprised out of women. To say that they're always going to lose 100% of the time because they're women is wrong. It's just flat out wrong. Are there inherent disadvantages? Of course there are. In terms of endurance sports, women generally can perform, not in every, but like long distance swimming, women outperform men, okay? And so when it comes to, cardiovascular endurance things, they can perform on a closer level to men than other competitions that, say, rely wholly upon strength. Like weightlifting, there's a big disparity. But in terms of marching and stuff, women have a pretty decent pain tolerance, so performing most of the tasks that you need your soldiers to perform in an army, in a warfare scenario, women would be able to do it to an acceptable equivalent level where they can be employed in an army very effectively, very viably. There are a few exceptional women who can meet the standard military strength requirements as men, but we must acknowledge that these women are the exceptions. In modern military tests, most women cannot meet the same physical standards as men. In one of the more recent result samples from the Army Combat Fitness Test, and bear in mind this wasn't an army-wide test, but it had a decent-sized sample group, 84% of women failed versus 30% of men. But this also means that 16% of women did pass this physical test. The most difficult routine being the leg tuck. But this also should be understood in context. Looking at the 2-mile run, only 6% of women failed at that versus 11% of men. So again, this was a sizable enough sample group, but it wasn't the whole army, and it goes to illustrate that there are some physical activities that women can perform at a very comparable level to men, and some in which they perform much worse than men. And once again, it was a more exceptional female soldier that was able to successfully pass this test, meaning they were able to complete all the separate physical tasks that were required. And a military unit comprised solely out of women will not be comprised solely of these exceptionally strong women. And if it was, there would be a vast number of women applicants who would have not met the standard. So, outside of that exception, all other female military units will always have a very significant physical disadvantage. But what we have to consider, honestly, is this, is if this all-female unit, both the ones that perhaps could meet the numbers required, that is solely comprised out of the very exceptionally strong female soldiers, or a military unit that is more representative of the standard athletic female physical capacities, would they hold no military value or usefulness? And the answer is, of course not. They would absolutely still hold a very significant measure of military usefulness that could be employed in warfare. But in regards to women's role in a military, there are far more debilitating things that must be considered that are actually separate to physical strength. And I mentioned some of them in my previous video. I want to talk about them again and also emphasize ones that I didn't emphasize enough, and some, other things that I think would impact it quite significantly. One of the most liberating things in human history for the roles that women can pick up and do with less, impacts on or things that prevent them from fulfilling those tasks effectively, is the birth control. Okay, contraception, effective contraception, honestly is a massive game changer in regards to human history and giving women the freedom to be able to look at fulfilling other roles in society that they generally didn't fulfill as prominently in the past. Sometimes just not at all, okay? Because having control over when, a woman falls pregnant, for the individual when she falls pregnant, okay, is a game changer. It really is, okay? The first thing that I think needs to be acknowledged is that most women, and on average, I'm not saying all women, because whenever you say something like that, it's like, well, I do, but most women on average, this is statistical, want to have children. There is a decent enough, sizable enough group who don't, but most do, okay? And if you apply this to historical context, when it was a more cultural kind of expectation that you're going to have, one of your roles is to have babies, it's going to be even more prominent. And so if that's going to be such a prominent thing, and then women have no control over when it happens, because this is the other reality that you just have to acknowledge in regards to the historical context, men and women, on average, they like to have sex. They're attracted to each other, okay? They get married, not always, and they have sex. And without contraception, there's a very likely, thing that happens afterwards. I'm just saying, okay? And so one of the ways that women, of course, and men, but we know the differences and stuff, would be out of control when they fall pregnant is by just not having sex, okay? But the thing is, women are still attracted to men and men are still attracted to women, okay? So it can be a bit more difficult, in abstaining in that regard. And so as soon as, women fall pregnant, and on average, because they like to have babies and stuff like that, in regards to a medieval setting, and this can be extrapolated to many other historical periods and locations, it's massively debilitating, all right? And so a woman who is pregnant is not going to be able to be nearly as effective as guys in an army, all right? And they get more, they have more trouble doing physical things the further the pregnancy develops. And then when you have the child needs to be taken care of, needs to be nursed, okay? Generally, when a woman is breastfeeding, it actually acts as a type of contraceptive. It's not 100%, but women basically don't fall pregnant when they're breastfeeding. Not always, but that's one of the things. And so throughout the entire, period where they're nursing, they generally won't fall pregnant. But after that, so this, from the pregnancy period and then the early time of the child, and children generally breastfed to longer periods of time, they didn't have formula replaced, and so that breastfeeding up to a year is common. And so that's a decent period of time, the time of pregnancy and the time of nursing, which a woman would not be able to get out of the house and either join an army, but even performing a trade and everything is going to be massively debilitating. And the average, amount of children that women had in the medieval period was 6, okay? Sometimes higher, sometimes lower. And so this is affecting so much because that's at least, 9 years, okay, 9 to 10 years, if they're having the average amount of children and the amount of, space between the children on average and things like that. Generally, it can be just a year from the pregnancy, and then you can fall pregnant at exact year. But if you're going with the average of breastfeeding being some measure of contraceptive thing, I guess it's 100%. Between 8 to 10 years, if they're having the average amount of children in a medieval period, women are either going to be pregnant or dealing with the result of pregnancy, and that's just not taking into account raising children after the nursing period, which generally falls on women, because during this time, it just makes logical sense that the guy's going to be working, okay, and supporting his family in whatever trade or whatever he does, okay? And if that man was promoted in some level, progressed in his profession, stuff like that, after all this has happened, who's earning more money right from the get-go? It's just a logical, natural thing that the guy is generally going to stay in the workforce, okay? And the wife is going to stay home and raise children. And there's a lot of other sociological, biological things that you can go into as to the roles that both men and women play in raising children, and the essential role that mothers play. Men are also absolutely essential, but they generally fulfill different needs for the children. And so with just pregnancy alone, as I mentioned in my previous video, we've just gone in more depth here, women, they're not going to be in a battle, okay, warfield. They were, there are exceptions, but on average, they're not going to be recruited en masse into an army. All right? Because even if, all right, if you're only recruiting non-married women, you have the big problem of men and women in an army. There are problems in the modern day. We're still trying to deal with that in modern day armies about the relationships between men and women in these type of scenarios, especially if they're actually under high stress environments, in a battle with other things like that. And so you're never going to be able to stop men and women hooking up when they're put together, in such close proximity and they're doing things together. And so if you have it in a medieval situation, if you had a chance, if you were recruiting half men and half women, and half of your army has a very decent chance that they're just going to fall pregnant because there's no contraceptive and people like to have sex, and then as soon as they're pregnant, they basically cannot function as a soldier in your army. No military commander in their right mind is ever going to recruit women on average as a common, regular thing. It's never going to happen. And that's the biological reality, because it's women that fall pregnant after sex, not men. Okay? There are other realities that also plays an interesting role. It will certainly play an effect as to would it cancel out completely, because if you add birth control into the mix, because that means men and women can have sex, and especially if it's reliable birth control, because even now birth control sometimes doesn't work, but if you're in a fantasy setting and you use magic, okay, this is a game changer, all right? And so I've been in the previous video I was like, what's something that could enable a high representation of women in an army in a medieval fantasy setting stuff? What's one of the things to change that makes it far more plausible and logical that you could actually pull it off in a realistic way. And as birth control. And you can add birth control in a fantasy setting really easily, especially magic birth control, I don't know, but not even magic, a plant, okay? A plant that's basically the pill, all right? And if women take it, boom, done, it's contraceptive, and that changes the game completely, all right? Because then you don't have this very high chance of losing half the people you're recruiting into your army because of this physically debilitating condition known as pregnancy. So it would solve a lot of problems. Not every problem, but it makes it far more functional, realistic, and plausible, okay? But some of the other problems, women's monthly cycles. That is something that should be addressed and acknowledged if you're going to try and to really realistically look at the viability of women being highly represented in a medieval army. And I'm using medieval context because that's my strongest, knowledge source and stuff like that. You can extrapolate it to other cultures and stuff, but I focus on medieval because that's where I know. That's my stuff. And yeah, like I said, so their monthly cycle, that's going to be interesting. Now, so I actually looked up how periods impact elite athletes, okay? There are studies done on it, and the results are very interesting. It seems to be very individual, where you can't say because women have monthly cycles, that means during a certain time of the month, bang, they're not going to be able to function effectively as a soldier. Well, the studies in regards to athletic females is some can. Some legitimately can perform and have won gold medals while right in the middle of their cycle, okay? That's happened. It seems to be more the exception, okay? But to say blanketly that it's always going to just take, women out of any physical role is incorrect. But there are many examples of the symptoms of the monthly cycle being quite physically debilitating for a certain number of women. And I don't know, like how would a medieval army try to account for that? If they had contraception, there are certain things like with medical technology today that women can take, which puts them into what's called like a low hormonal state, which lowers the severity of a period when it happens. And so again, if you have a magical plant that's a contraceptive, have another magical plant that lowers the severity of a period, and that'll solve that problem quite easily. But if not, how would a medieval army do it? It'd be a weird thing to recruit. So does your monthly period physically debilitate you? I need to know. I gotta ask. So maybe they do that, all right? And you would certainly find out in training because like when these studies were done and they're, measuring these athletes, women who do get affected physically from their periods when it happens, their performance does drop. There are some women it doesn't, but it can be recorded that their physical, like for athletes, the speed they're running, just all the, the indicators and results that they're recording dip, right, throughout that time, right? And so even if they didn't report it, through the training process, the people observing it would be able to, okay, sorry, there's one time a month in which we notice that you're not marching as far as everyone else. We can't, like, if we need to march to a battlefield to intersect an enemy, we can't, and that falls within that time. Having a certain number of soldiers in your army that are getting physically, affected and aren't able to keep up to muster, I mean, just like a man who isn't physically strong enough to march the length of need and everything like that, a competent military commander, because winning wars is a very serious business, they're going to get cut, okay? It doesn't mean that having someone still trained that might not be useful, especially if it's not like if you're being besieged and you need every, viable person who's mildly competent with a weapon. I'm not saying they wouldn't hold any, of course, anybody would still hold value, even these guys that weren't able to march far enough, because the idea that an army just, like if we're looking at men specifically, just said, oh, all right, you're physically weaker, no, you're not in. No, there were many situations in which armies just took in everyone, because even if they're not performing as well as everyone else, every sword, spear, bow counted, and they needed it. And because it's either that or our entire, city, kingdom is going to be overrun, of course, all right? Some people have also said that women would not be able to function as well as men in heavy armor. And again, that's taking the assumption that armor is significantly heavy. And we actually, look, on average, when you look at modern day armies, and it sometimes is an unfair comparison to compare modern to history and stuff, but there are some things that I think can be translated a bit better. And on average, when, you have the same strength level requirements, that you need to meet to enter an army, on average, women do not perform and reach those standards nearly as often as men do. But there are some women who can. And these types of women, they can march as much as men, and they'd be able to function and fight in armor easily, because the comparison is like when in like armies they're marching, the military backpack they're carrying on average is about the same weight as a full suit of full plate armor, okay? And if women can do it in certain circumstances, like women who are generally stronger than the average woman and they pass the requirements and things, yeah, they could absolutely wear the armor as well. And so to say that it can't, and the other thing is, even if they are not as strong as the average man, armor is light and it's more distributed over the whole body. And when I say light, it doesn't weigh nothing, okay? Of course it has weight to it. But my point is, they would absolutely be able to fight effectively in armor, okay, on average. Now, in my other video, I also mentioned sociological conditions about gender roles and stuff like that, which affected not only I guess, expectation between the genders of who is going to be able to fight, but also the natural training and stuff like that, because, you know, boys often play fight, and I'll say some girls don't, okay, but boys on average do play fight more. That's actually a form of physical training in terms of combat and fighting, and so it's easy to recruit men when they're already mature, because they already have a certain measure of, you know, capacity for combat in like that they've learned throughout their whole upbringing. And if women went through that same process, and then you could address certain other issues that we've talked about, absolutely women would be a very viable and valuable addition to an army, because it would bolster recruitment. And a larger army generally has a slight advantage, okay? But of course, when we look at the historical period, when these cultural, you know, sociological kind of conditions were in place, and then you also have situations, oh, by the way, as well, like I should have mentioned this in the whole, if you don't have contraceptives, okay, and women fall pregnant and stuff like that, mortality during childbirth, it's very high during the medieval period, okay? And so not only do you, like, is there a good chance that if you recruit women and there's no contraceptive in their period and stuff like that, they fall pregnant and they wouldn't be able to fight in armies, but there's a good chance that they're going to die during childbirth as well, and then you lose your soldier, and you have all the investment and the resources that you devoted to training and equipping them is just gone, okay? So that's going to be another problem as well. I mean, like, when you look at things like that, it's not that women can't fight effectively in one-on-one combat or be trained up to be an effective soldier. They can. It's not for those reasons that they weren't put in. But when I say effective soldier, I do admit these debilitating conditions, you could say, makes them more ineffective than compared. But if you just like, if they're trained and you take them in a single one day, are they capable? Are they able to do it? Yes, they can. Okay. Even in the medieval period, women would be able to become competent, effective soldiers, and we know from without any contestation, the evidence is in, okay, they absolutely can be very effective swordsmen, swordswomen, whatever, as well. So it's not for those reasons women didn't fight in the medieval battlefield, because people then take the conclusion, which is the whole opening of this video, is that women fighting against men in a battle warfare scenario would lose 100% of the time. No, all right? That's wrong. The reasons why women weren't in battlefields were, they're very biological, but it's not because of strength differences or their competency, capacity for being able to fight effectively. The natural disadvantage absolutely is still there, but it can be overcome and honestly applies less. When I was trying, it does apply, the strength disadvantage does apply in certain situations on the battlefield, but overall, I actually find that it applies less because it can be overcome through other things. Tactics being a massive one. And as we've already talked about, when you address those things, and if they were capable of being addressed in the medieval period itself, we go back in time and say, here's a plant that will solve the monthly cycle and contraceptive. I actually think that, well, gee, yeah, like that would throw society on its head, like from a medieval context. So it's not just the battlefield. Wow, because it threw society on its head, like when it came in our time, okay? And if you had it coming in earlier, there are a lot of implications that you would want to logically extrapolate to try and figure out, because it honestly liberated women's role in society in a big way. So these are important things to consider, and it's a good, interesting topic just to sink your teeth into, isn't it? And these are the type I like addressing interesting things. So these have been my thoughts on it. Do share your thoughts in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. And of course, I look forward to seeing you in the next video. So until then, farewell.